In his book, In the Eye of the Storm, Max Lucado tells about something that happened to him while he was in high school. Every year, he and his family used to go fishing during spring break. But one year, his brother and his mom couldn't go. So his dad let him invite a friend. Max and his dad looked forward to this vacation with great anticipation. They pictured the sun shining down on them as they sat in the boat in the middle of the lake, the pull of the rod and the spin of the reel as they pulled the fish into the boat, the smell of the fish frying on an open fire. They could hardly wait. Finally, spring break arrived. They loaded their car and set out for the lake. They arrived at night, set up the camper, and went to bed eager to get up the next morning and go fishing. But that night there was a strong wind that blew through. The next morning, the wind was so strong they could barely open the door of the camper. The sky got darker. The lake was rough. There was no way they could fish in that weather. No problem, they said. They would spend the day in the camper. They had carried copies of Reader's Digest and other magazines. They knew a few jokes. It wasn't what they came to do, but they would make the best of it and fish the next day. So they passed the day indoors. The hours passed slowly. Night finally came and they crawled into their sleeping bags, dreaming of fishing. The next morning, it wasn't the wind that made the door hard to open. It was the ice. It had got cold in the night. It was too treacherous to get out. They tried to be cheerful. No problem, they said. We can play Scrabble again. We can reread the stories in the Reader's Digest. And surely we know another joke or two. But they weren't cheerful about it at all. And as the day went on, they began to get more and more irritable and tensed. It was a long day and a long night. The next morning, when they awoke to the sound of hailstones hitting on the roof, they didn't even pretend to be cheerful. They were flat out grumpy. They sat in misery the whole day, their fishing equipment still unpacked. The next day was even colder, and they finally headed home, 3 disgruntled fishermen. But Max Lucado says that he learned an important lesson that week, not about fishing, but about people. He writes, when those who are called to fish don't fish, they fight. And that's true about fishing for fish and fishing for souls. When energy intended to be used outside is used inside, the result is explosive. Instead of casting nets, we cast stones. Instead of being fishers of the lost, we become critics of one another. This is a very simple and important message for all Christians today. It is important for the life and sustenance of community. When those who are called to fish don't fish, they fight. Let's face it, the sad reality is that most of us aren't concerned with fishing for men and women anymore in the same way that Jesus intended to go to the peripheries. We talk about the mission of the church. We talk about our vision, but we gave up fishing long ago. We are willing to accept a fish if it leaps into the boat by itself, but we are really not all that interested in casting our nets or doing the really hard work it takes to pull them in. We would do well to listen to Max Lucado's warning. When fishermen don't fish, problems arise. You know the original story of the call of Jesus' earliest disciples. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, Matthew tells us, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. He saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat, their father, and followed him. It's a great story, but it's not the whole story. If we turn over to Matthew chapter 20, verses 20 to 24, we read these words. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons, James and John, came to Jesus with her son and kneeling down asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." You remember that little story, don't you? Notice how this passage ends. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. The disciples had forgotten all about fishing for people. They had already started struggling over who was the greatest in the kingdom. When fishermen don't fish, says Max Lucado, they fight. It's true. This is an important principle. As long as believers are working together for a common goal, there is harmony and unity. But when the work stops and the talking starts, so does the struggle over who's the greatest. We start worrying over who the parish priest is paying attention to and who he is not. And soon the church has lost its focus. We get upset over who is singing a solo in the choir. We get flustered if someone new sits in our pew. We get indignant if someone else gets the office that we think should have been ours. When fishermen don't fish, they fight. Second, it's also true that when fishermen don't fish, they run away. There's a little story in Luke chapter 22, verses 56 to 62. It concerns the man called Simon Peter. It takes place while Jesus is being interrogated by the high priest. A servant girl sees Simon Peter seated there in the firelight. She looks closely at him and says, "This man was with him," referring to Jesus. But Simon Peter denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you are talking about." Just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the words the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went and wept outside bitterly. Peter, the big fisherman, ran when times got tough. And how often we do the same. When we lose sight of our call, we run away from every problem. Little things make us cut and run. I read about a priest in one of the villages where his community was driven out of the village, many Christians massacred, and were forced to live in the jungles. The church was broken down. The priest left the villages and he took shelter in the bishop's house in a big city. When I read that, I wondered who would have the courage to stand by the villagers and stand for them. Would we do it, Or would we, like Simon Peter, run away? When fishermen don't fish, they fight. And when fishermen don't fish, they run away. But there's one thing more. We need to say, when fishermen don't fish, they forget. In John chapter 21, verses 1 to 3, we discover an interesting event in the lives of the disciples. It takes place after the resurrection. John paints a picture for us. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I am going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into a boat. But that night they caught nothing. Why? Why did they catch nothing? Metaphorically, it is because a boat was the wrong place for them to be. Jesus had told them he wanted them to be fishing for people, and they were still content fishing for fish. We understand that, don't we? It's a lot more fun to fish for fish than it is to fish for people. And fishing for people is a whole lot harder. I wonder if there could be any young adults in your community who are struggling with addictions of some kind. I wonder if there are any middle-aged adults for whom alcohol is their chief nemesis. Is there any way we could reach out to them, minister to them? Could there be anyone in your community struggling to make ends meet? Maybe they have lost their job. Maybe they have lost their home. I wonder if there are any families that have been split asunder by divorce. I wonder if their children are hurting and need to be surrounded with love. As the community of faith, is there something we can do for them? When fishermen don't fish, they forget what their primary reason for being is. Our comfort, our contentment becomes more important than doing God's will. When fishermen don't fish, they fight. When fishermen don't fish, they lose their courage and run away. When fishermen don't fish, they forget their primary reason for being. Someone has said that there is a thin line between fishing and standing on the shore looking like an idiot. Maybe it's time we risk looking like an idiot for Christ's sake. Let's get back to our primary task, reaching out and ministering to people. Amen.